In the decades preceding the Second World War, Jewish life in Europe constituted a rich and intricate tapestry, firmly rooted in ancient traditions. Each community followed its own cadence, shaped by religious festivals, rituals, spoken and sung languages, and the accumulated memory of generations accustomed to cycles of stability interrupted by recurring surges of hostility across the continent. From the shtetls of Poland and the Baltic lands to the middle-class districts of Vienna and Berlin, European Judaism manifested itself in varied and, above all, dynamic forms. In Warsaw, for example, a city where more than one-third of the inhabitants were Jewish, the sound of Yiddish intertwined with Polish was an ordinary feature of everyday urban life. In Berlin, universities admitted Jewish students who aspired to professions as physicians, attorneys, and engineers. In Paris, Jewish intellectual culture radiated from cafes and salons where discussions of modernity, identity, and assimilation thrived. Many Jews felt a deep emotional bond to their countries of residence. Cultural integration had advanced substantially in Western Germany since the late 19th century, where Jewish families occupied prominent positions in banking, law, medicine, and the arts and fostered a strong sense of German national belonging. In France, after the shock of the Dreyfus Affair, the Third Republic worked to reinforce principles of equality and citizenship, allowing for a comparatively stable integration of Jews from Central and Western Europe. A widespread belief held that anti-Semitism, though persistent, was gradually declining and largely confined to ultra-conservative circles with little influence over modern political life. Eastern Europe, however, presented markedly different conditions. Areas such as Poland, Romania, and Ukraine contained large, diverse, and often impoverished Jewish populations. The shtetls, small towns in which religious life stood at the heart of existence, preserved traditions that would later be almost entirely destroyed. Within these communities lived learned rabbis, merchants, craftsmen, tanners, printers, tailors, and teachers who dedicated their lives to Talmudic scholarship and the maintenance of communal institutions. Synagogues occupied a central place in town life, and daily routines unfolded amid markets, fairs, minor quarrels, joyous weddings, and a strong sense of collective cohesion. In larger cities such as Vilna or Kiev, Jewish society was divided among an industrial working class, an expanding commercial bourgeoisie, and an intellectual elite actively involved in national politics. Zionist, socialist, and religious movements debated competing visions of the future. Some championed full integration into modern nation-states, others promoted emigration to Palestine, while more traditional groups sought to preserve communal structures as they had existed for centuries. This plurality of perspectives generated a distinctive cultural environment that combined modern openness with the endurance of ancient customs. Despite progress in many regions, tension remained a constant presence. In parts of Eastern Europe, pogroms inherited from the 19th century resurfaced whenever economic or political crises intensified. Countries such as Romania experienced repeated waves of violence and discrimination driven by ultranationalist movements. In Poland, economic competition and political rivalry between Catholic and Jewish communities sparked protests, commercial boycotts, and restrictions on Jewish university students. Although often localized, these incidents left deep marks on collective memory, serving as reminders that stability could disintegrate overnight. In Germany, resentment rooted in the Treaty of Versailles nourished narratives portraying Jews as responsible for military defeat and economic hardship. While such views were not dominant before 1933, they were promoted by extremist groups employing inflammatory rhetoric. Even so, many German Jewish families felt secure, trusted Republican institutions, and could not imagine that what they perceived as fringe anti-Semitism would evolve into official state policy. Jewish culture flourished throughout Europe. Yiddish literature entered a golden age, with writers such as Sholem Aleichem whose depictions of everyday life resonated widely. Jewish theater emerged as a powerful artistic force, traveling from Vilna to New York with companies staging dramas, satires, and historical works. In the religious sphere, Hasidism retained profound influence, particularly in Poland and Hungary, where rebbes exercised spiritual and moral authority. At the same time, reform and liberal movements introduced new interpretations of religious practice, especially in Germany and Austria, where synagogues adopted modern music and sermons delivered in the vernacular. Jewish life was also shaped by internal debates. Many young people believed traditional structures had stagnated in the face of modern challenges. Influenced by socialism and labor movements, new generations pursued identities defined more by politics than religion, while Orthodox communities viewed rapid modernization and assimilation with apprehension. These discussions unfolded in community meetings, newspapers, and public spaces, creating a lively atmosphere characteristic of cities with substantial Jewish populations. Economic circumstances varied widely. In Vienna prior to the Nazi annexation, Jews held influential roles in medicine, publishing, and music. In Berlin, they were prominent in cabaret, cinema, and architecture. In Eastern Europe, However, much of the Jewish population survived through modest trades. Nevertheless, education remained a central value everywhere. Jewish schools, both religious and secular, nurtured a literate generation with a strong cultural identity expressed through study, music, and communal involvement. Alongside this cultural richness existed a subtle but growing sense of vulnerability, particularly among those attentive to political developments. Nationalist rhetoric spreading through Germany, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe increasingly incorporated explicit anti-Semitic themes. Yet few comprehended the scale of the catastrophe that lay ahead. Most believed life would continue as it always had, defined by negotiation with authorities and the adaptive resilience that had characterized European Judaism for centuries. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, concern spread, but panic did not immediately follow. Many Jewish leaders in Germany assumed the new government would impose harsher measures but believed legal institutions would restrain excesses. Few anticipated that long-standing prejudices, nationalist resentments, and conspiracy theories would solidify into a systematic program of persecution. When Hitler assumed office in January 1933, anti-Semitism, long a loud but marginal current, was transformed into official state ideology. For millions of European Jews, especially those under German influence, this marked the beginning of a profound and carefully engineered transformation of daily life. Insults, caricatures, and sporadic discrimination gave way to a political and social apparatus designed to exclude, humiliate, and isolate Jews step by step. From the outset, the Nazi regime sought to cloak exclusion in legality, employing laws, decrees, and propaganda to normalize persecution and embed it in everyday existence. The process unfolded swiftly and methodically. Within weeks, the regime organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses, presented as a defensive response to alleged international conspiracies. SA members positioned themselves in front of shops, medical practices, and law offices, marking them with stars of David and threatening slogans. Although the boycott lasted only a single day, it represented a decisive turning point. The state had publicly identified Jews as internal enemies. This initiated a tightening mechanism applied with calculated precision. From 1933 onward, legislation was enacted to expel Jews from professional life. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service removed thousands of teachers, professors, judges, and public servants. Jewish physicians lost their licenses, lawyers were excluded from courtrooms, and artists saw their work removed from museums and theaters. Professional exclusion impoverished families and dismantled social networks, delivering an unmistakable signal of marginalization. At the same time, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels transformed anti-Semitism into a constant presence in daily life. Films, newsreels, newspapers, and radio broadcasts incessantly portrayed Jews as responsible for Germany's economic, moral, and cultural decline. Publications such as Der Stürmer inundated streets with grotesque caricatures that revived medieval and pseudoscientific stereotypes. This propaganda was not merely persuasive, it was saturating. Relentless repetition reshaped public perception until falsehoods became an inescapable mental environment. Science was likewise instrumentalized. Pseudobiological theories of racial purity gained prominence in universities and research institutions. Lectures on racial hygiene proliferated, and concepts such as German blood and Aryan race were formalized as state categories. The objective was to construct an intellectual framework that legitimized exclusion, allowing society to perceive persecution not as hatred but as necessary policy. Between 1933 and 1935, this ideological groundwork paved the way for a decisive escalation. On September 15, 1935, during the Nuremberg Party rally, the regime enacted two foundational laws, the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. Jews were stripped of citizenship and prohibited from marrying or engaging in relations with those deemed of German blood. Crucially, Jewish identity was defined not by religion but by ancestry. This transformation was devastating, turning Jewishness into an inescapable legal classification immune to conversion, integration, or patriotism. After Nuremberg, restrictions multiplied, expulsions from public schools, bans from sports, business limitations, property confiscations, movement controls, and compulsory administrative markings. Each measure was accompanied by propaganda portraying exclusion as essential to protecting Germany. Anti-Semitism became not only official policy but a social obligation, embraced by those who found in Jews convenient scapegoats during crisis. In Austria, conditions deteriorated sharply after the 1938 annexation. Following the Anschluss, public humiliations were brutal. Jews were forced to scrub streets on their knees, shops were looted, and synagogues were destroyed by mobs encouraged by Nazi authorities. The violence was immediate, spontaneous, and deeply symbolic. Austria demonstrated to the Reich how quickly hatred could spread when authority validated it. Thousands of Jewish families desperately sought visas to immigrate. But the world caught between economic crisis and political fears closed its doors one after another. The Evian Conference held that same year made clear that the international community was unwilling to accept a massive influx of Jewish refugees. The combination of legal exclusion, constant propaganda, and public humiliation shattered the last hopes of those who still believed hostility was temporary. Each week seemed to establish a new rule, erase a right, and narrow the margin for survival. By 1938, Jews lived in a state of legal suffocation, confined between economic restrictions and a poisoned social climate that normalized violence. Many still tried to maintain routines, improvised schools, community activities, mutual aid. But the country they had known, one of imperfect coexistence, gradual integration, and shared citizenship, had vanished under the weight of an ideology that considered them a biological danger. Radicalization intensified throughout the year. The speeches of Hitler and Goebbels openly discussed expulsion, isolation, and solutions to the Jewish question. In the streets, the SA and the Gestapo acted with growing impunity. Small acts of violence became routine and Jews were beaten, detained or robbed of their belongings without any possibility of justice. The population exposed to years of propaganda oscillated between indifference, fear, and in some cases active complicity. By the end of 1938, the situation reached a boiling point. The combination of extremist ideology, social resentment, and a state apparatus ready to act culminated in the first massive and coordinated outbreak of violence by the Nazi regime against the Jews of 1938, Germany and Austria. A night of fire, shattered glass, and destruction marked the end of the illusion that the persecution could be stopped and opened the door to an even darker phase of the Nazi project. Kristalln, 19. From the night of November 9, 1938, an unusual silence settled over German cities. At first glance, nothing suggested that within a few hours, this silence would be replaced by the simultaneous shattering of thousands of windows, the smoke of burning synagogues, and the screams of Jewish families awakened by pounding on their doors. Kristall, the night of broken glass, was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, as Nazi propaganda claimed the following day. It was an organized, encouraged, and coordinated attack by the regime, combining street violence with public humiliation and the methodical destruction of every visible trace of Jewish life in Germany and Austria. The official trigger was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst Vomrat, by a desperate young Polish Jew whose family had been expelled. The Nazis used the incident as the perfect pretext. Joseph Goebbels, aware of the political opportunity, delivered an incendiary speech to party members and ordered that the indignation be expressed immediately. But this indignation did not come from the civilian population. It came from the SASSS Gestapo and organized groups who received precise instructions. The violence was planned, although presented as an emotional outburst. The first synagogues began to burn as night fell. In Munich, Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, and more than 1,000 towns, Nazi commandos forced their way into buildings, smashed windows, dragged Torah scrolls into the streets, and set them on fire. The religious buildings, often constructed through the great effort of centuries-old communities, became bonfires, visible for miles. Firefighters appeared in multiple locations, but they had orders intervene only to protect adjacent Aryan property, not to save synagogues. The message was clear. This destruction was permitted, legitimized, and celebrated. The streets filled with broken glass, smashed furniture, and merchandise scattered across the ground. Jewish shops, medical offices, and businesses were looted simultaneously. The attackers moved without hurry, knowing no one would stop them. Entire families were driven from their homes during the night, forced to watch as strangers. Destroyed possessions accumulated over a lifetime. Many were beaten in front of their neighbors, forced to clear debris, or dragged away by the Gestapo. The climate of terror advanced from house to house. In Berlin, more than 40 synagogues were attacked. In Vienna, the violence took on almost ritual dimensions. Jews were forced to kneel and pray while crowds insulted and beat them. In smaller towns where everyone knew each other, the brutality took on an even more sinister tone.
Former customers and co-workers watched in
silence or with complicity as their Jewish neighbors were stripped of everything.
The violence was not limited to material destruction.
Between 30,000 and 35,000 Jewish men were arrested within hours and sent to concentration camps such as Dau, Kenwald, and Sachsenhausen.
Many were not accused of any crime.
Their arrest was collective punishment and a message of terror. For days, they were subjected to torture,
forced labor, and humiliation. To secure their release, many families had to sign documents consenting to the forced sale
of their businesses, homes, and property at absurdly low prices.
Kristallnacht was not only physical violence,
it was a carefully integrated process of economic plunder.
The international reaction was
one of indignation, but it produced no significant changes.
Countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom,
and France condemned the events, but maintained restrictive immigration policies for Jewish refugees.
The
international community watched with horror, but without decisive action, as a modern European state unleashed open
persecution against hundreds of thousands of people marked as enemies because of their origin. For many German Jews, this was the moment when the hope that state institutions could stop Nazi radicalization collapsed. That night
made it clear that the persecution was no longer a gradual campaign.
It had entered an openly violent phase. Following the attack, the Nazi regime deepened exclusion with new legal measures. Jews were required to pay a
collective contribution of 1 billion Reichsmarks as compensation for the damages caused by their own attackers. They were forbidden to attend public schools, use transportation, visit theaters, or own businesses.
Before
Kristallnacht, some still hoped to withstand the storm.
After it, everything became urgent. Immigration became a race against time.
But obtaining visas was nearly impossible. For many survivors, the memory of that night remained the moment when their country, where they had been born, educated, worked, and raised their
children, revealed itself as a mortal threat.
The crunching of broken glass, the fires illuminating dark streets, and the screams echoing under an indifferent sky became symbols of a new stage.
Violence was no longer a prelude, but the announcement of something far more terrible.
While the smoke from the synagogue still hung in the air, the Nazi regime began consolidating a new strategy to manage the Jewish presence
in occupied territories. This next step, seemingly administrative, would
transform entire cities into spaces of confinement and total control.
Here began the era of the ghettos, the creation of the ghettos.
When the German invasion of Poland began on September
1, 1939, millions of Jews were trapped in a territory that soon became the central laboratory of the Reich's anti-Semitic policy.
The idea of separating them from the rest of the population, presented by the Nazis as a security and sanitary measure, was in reality a necessary preliminary step for
future physical elimination.
The creation of the ghettos was not improvised. It was the result of calculated, studied, and administratively endorsed decisions aimed at transforming entire cities into spaces of isolation, suffering, and slow death. The orders were first implemented in the Polish territories directly annexed to the Reich and shortly thereafter in the General Government, a vast region
administered as a German colony.
There, civilian and military authorities began clearing whole neighborhoods to concentrate Jews in limited areas, often old, deteriorated residential zones.
The logic was simple and cruel. Imprison hundreds of thousands of people in confined spaces, reduce their access to
food, work, and housing, and let them survive as they could while the Nazi machinery developed more definitive
plans. The Łódź Ghetto, one of the first and strictest, was sealed in April 1940.
More than 160,000 Jews were trapped within a maze of narrow streets fenced with barbed wire and guarded by armed patrols. The gates were controlled by German police and a Jewish auxiliary force forced to obey impossible orders.
Hunger set in within weeks.
The official rations were so limited that thousands depended on smuggling, which in turn was punished with summary executions.
The factories installed inside the ghetto turned into forced labor workshops were
presented as a chance for survival, but also served to exploit labor under inhuman conditions.
In Warsaw, where
more than 350,000 Jews had lived before the war, the situation reached colossal
dimensions. The ghetto was formally established in November 1940, becoming the largest confinement space in modern
history. Wall by wall, stone by stone, the Nazis erected a physical barrier that not only divided the city, but silently transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Inside the ghetto, human density reached unthinkable levels, up to 9 people per room. The streets were crowded with street vendors, children searching for food, and elderly people walking slowly in search of help. Despite everything, life attempted to persist. Secret schools, improvised libraries, clandestine theater performances, and networks of solidarity emerged to balance the impossible, surviving in a space designed to extinguish them. The Kov ghetto was smaller, but no less oppressive. There the Germans expelled thousands of Jews from their homes in the historic city center and relocated them to an isolated neighborhood across the Vistula River. Material conditions were poor and hunger constant, but small pockets of cultural resistance also emerged. Rabbis who organized secret study groups, doctors who without medicine tried to stop epidemics with knowledge and discipline, and families who celebrated holidays with the little they could preserve. The administrative process that created these ghettos was as rigid as it was dehumanizing. Every Jew had to identify themselves with a yellow star sewn onto their clothing. They had to register their possessions, report changes of residence, and comply with strict curfews. But confinement was accompanied by total economic control. The Nazis seized businesses, confiscated property, and supervised every commercial activity. The goal was to remove autonomy, destroy dignity, and turn Jewish communities into a mass completely dependent on German decisions. At the same time, the ghettos became spaces where Jewish leadership organized in the Judenrate, mandatory councils imposed by the Nazis had to face impossible decisions. These councils administered food, work, housing, and health under conditions of brutal scarcity. Their members live trapped between the harsh demands of German authorities and the desperation of their own people, aware that any unfulfilled order could trigger collective punishments. There was no room for pure ethics in a system designed to erode morality from within. Hunger was from the beginning a weapon of war. Official rations in Warsaw amounted to about 184 calories per day. For Jews, an amount insufficient to keep an adult standing. Widespread malnutrition made diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis endemic. Weakened bodies, extremely thin children, elderly people collapsing in the streets. Everyday life in a ghetto was a succession of heavy silences, endless lines, and a constant struggle to obtain the most basic necessities. Despite this, cultural life persisted. In Warsaw, poets and musicians continued creating works that circulated secretly. Clandestine diaries were organized to document daily life, knowing that one day the world would need evidence. The Secret on Shabbat archive led by Emanuel Ringelblum gathered thousands of documents, letters, children's drawings, and testimonies that would survive to tell the story from within. The preservation of memory became an act of resistance. Each ghetto developed its own rhythm, its own pain, and its own way of holding on to life. But all shared the same destiny. They were designed to be temporary. The Nazis never intended them as permanent spaces, but as places to concentrate entire populations until their final fate was determined. That fate began to take shape in 1941 when the German invasion of the Soviet Union further radicalized anti-Semitic policy and turned confinement into a deadly prelude. The Vannes Conference. On the morning of January 20, 1942, frost covered the shores of Lake Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin. The villa where the meeting would take place appeared calm, almost idyllic. From the outside, no one would have suspected that behind its windows decisions would be made that would seal the fate of millions of human beings. Amid cups of coffee, cigarettes, and calculated administrative language, high officials of the Third Reich coordinated the logistics of the most systematic crime in modern history. The Bonn Conference was not the origin of the genocide, but it was the moment when the killing machinery became organized, standardized, and approved by the main institutions of the German state. The meeting, convened by Reinhard Heydrich, who served as chief of the Reich Main Security Office, had a clear objective: to secure the cooperation of the various ministries and agencies in implementing the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. That cold and deceptive term had been circulating among senior Nazi leaders for months. But in Wannsee, it acquired a concrete meaning. Industrial murder, mass deportations, extermination camps, and the complete elimination of Jewish life in Europe. The purpose was not to debate whether they should do it, but how to do it efficiently. The main document presented by Heydrich listed approximately 11 million Jews living in European territories or under
German influence.
The precision of the figures revealed the scope of the plan from Jews in the Reich to those in Spain, Britain, Switzerland, the Balkans, the Soviet Union, and Turkey. Every community, regardless of size or
level of integration, was included in the extermination projection.
The terminology used, such as evacuation, special treatment, or work under supervision, was made up of euphemisms designed to conceal the real brutality of the project. Heydrich explained that the war had created a historic opportunity to carry out the final
solution:
the massive displacement of population, administrative chaos in occupied territories, and total control
over Poland and Eastern Europe would facilitate the implementation of extreme measures.
The plan envisioned transporting Jews from every corner of Europe to the east, where they would first be subjected to forced labor.
After the inevitable natural mortality through exhaustion and starvation, the survivors considered by the Nazis to be the most resistant would be systematically killed. The coldness with which these points were discussed struck those who studied the document decades later. WWII was not an emotional outburst of hatred but a session of public administration. Those present, representatives from
ministries such as Justice, Interior, Transport and Foreign Affairs, took notes, corrected details, and raised logistical questions. The disagreements were not about the morality of the plan, since no one questioned the genocide, but about jurisdiction, legal competencies, and administrative procedures. The tone was one of
efficiency, not violence.
This normalization of mass murder was one of the most chilling aspects of the
meeting.
One of the tensest points emerged when discussing who should be considered Jewish.
The Nuremberg laws had established categories based on family ancestry,
but there were complex cases, mixed marriages, converts, decorated war veterans.
For those present, these ambiguities represented bureaucratic obstacles that needed to be resolved so that the deportation could be complete. Heydrich's response was blunt: any biological connection, however minimal, should be included as a criterion for elimination. The attendees accepted the statement without objection.
Another crucial aspect of the meeting was the need to coordinate railway transport. Industrial murder could not be carried out without an efficient train system capable of moving
millions of people to the extermination centers.
The Ministry of Transport represented at WWII assumed that
responsibility with disturbing efficiency, schedules, routes, wagon availability, military priorities.
Everything was part of the calculations needed for the genocide to advance without interruption.
The conference
also explicitly mentioned the extermination camps that were already operating or being expanded, such as Belzec, Soiber, and Treblinka, where gas would become the primary method for killing large numbers of people within
minutes.
One did not invent these camps, but it incorporated them into a centralized structure that allowed their scale to multiply.
The meeting lasted barely an hour and a half. When it
ended, the participants exchanged polite farewells, made trivial comments, and returned to their offices.
None had held
a weapon or witnessed an execution that day, but all had contributed to designing the system that would lead to
the deaths of millions.
This contrast between the appearance of administrative normality and the brutality of the
purpose is one of the reasons why WWII remains a dark symbol of modernity in the service of extermination. The final report, drafted by Adolf Eichmann, used technical language that diluted the real violence hidden behind bureaucratic expressions.
Only decades later, when copy number 16 of the protocol was
recovered, could the world clearly see how the document that ordered the final phase of the genocide had been formulated.
Every sentence was another component in a mechanism designed to eliminate without exception the Jews of
Europe. After the conference, the steps accelerated. Deportations intensified. Immediately, overcrowded trains left large and small cities every day,
and the ghettos, weakened by hunger and disease, became waiting stations for a much worse fate.
WWII had provided the
missing coordination, allowing the final solution to move from theory to mass murder. As the wagons were prepared and Railway routes adjusted to absorb the human flow, millions of Jews in Europe, unaware of the content of that secret meeting, began to see their ghettos emptied, their streets filled with soldiers, and the word relocation
transformed into an irreversible sentence that would culminate in the trains now departing with no return toward the extermination camps, the deportations to the extermination camps from 1942 onward. At the beginning of 1942, while snow
covered tracks, stations, and rooftops across much of Europe, trains began to turn into the main instrument of
genocide. For millions of Jews, the metallic sound of an approaching convoy no longer meant transport or commerce,
but a dark destination from which no one returned.
After the Wannsee Conference, mass deportations ceased to be isolated
episodes and became a systematic policy coordinated and carried out with relentless precision.
The Reich Railway administration became a central part of the crime.
Organized schedules, defined routes, and freight trains assigned
exclusively to the daily transfer of human beings to the extermination camps.
The ghettos, already weakened by hunger,
disease, and isolation, entered a period of progressive liquidation. In Warsaw, the first deportations began in July 1942.
The Germans announced that the Jews would be resettled in the East for work, but the word work was a cruel disguise. Streets were filled with posters ordering people to report for transport, and anyone who disobeyed faced immediate arrest or execution. Every morning, massive columns of people were marched to the Schlagplatz, the transfer square where they boarded
cattle wagons bound for Treblinka. Tens of thousands disappeared within weeks. In Łódź, the process was administered with extreme bureaucratic coldness. The ghetto, transformed into a complex of forced labor workshops, remained active longer because it produced uniforms, shoes, and equipment for the German army. However, even that economic value did not protect its population. Starting in 1942, the trains began to take the elderly and sick first, then
the children during a particularly traumatic operation known as the spare, and finally entire families.
Every announcement of a new deportation generated scenes of despair. Parents hiding their children in basement,
elderly people begging to be left behind, mothers offering valuables to bribe guards.
Nothing stopped the process. The freight wagons designed to transport animals or goods became mobile chambers of suffering.
In a single wagon, between 70 and 100 people could be crammed in with no seats, no water,
and only a small opening for air. The doors were locked from the outside with metal bolts. And once inside, the world
was reduced to the smell of fear, the press of bodies, and the creaking of wood under the movement of the train.
Many died before reaching their destination. Asphyxiation, dehydration, heart attacks.
Those who survived did so in a state of extreme exhaustion.
Deportations were not limited to Poland. In France, the police actively collaborated in the arrest of foreign and French Jews.
The Villiers Roundup in July 1942 turned a sports stadium into a massive confinement space where thousands of people were packed together without ventilation or drinking water
for days before being sent to Auschwitz. In the Netherlands, deportation began at Westerbork, a transit camp where families sometimes waited for weeks for the train that would take them east. In
Slovakia, Hungary, Belgium, and Greece, trains also filled with entire communities torn from their homes.
The logistics of the crime required constant coordination.
The Reichsbahn charged
fees per transported person as if it were just another commercial service. Administrative offices calculated costs, schedules, and wagon availability.
Daily reports recorded how many Jews had been sent, how many had died en route, and
how many had arrived. Dehumanization was total. Each individual was reduced to a number on a list, a figure in a bureaucratic report. Psychological terror was as devastating as physical suffering. No one knew exactly what happened in the extermination camps, but rumors grew.
Stories circulated in the ghettos about people disappearing, about
trains that left and never returned.
Some spoke of deadly showers, pits,
constant smoke in the forests. Although many refused to believe it, the intuition that resettlement hid something irreparable grew stronger.
Even so, the deception persisted.
The Germans ordered deportees to bring
luggage, documents, utensils, as if a new life awaited them.
This pretense kept order until the very last moment.
One of the most disturbing cases was that of Hungary.
In 1944, within just 8
weeks, around 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz.
One of the fastest and largest operations of the entire Holocaust.
Entire trains arrived every day, filled almost exclusively with complete families, many of whom had not previously experienced the systematic violence that had devastated Poland. The tracks never rested. It was a constant, almost industrial flow. The end of the journey was always the same: a platform, blinding lights, shouting in German, barking dogs, abrupt orders. The deportees stumbled out, disoriented after days in darkness. There began the selection. Men and women separated, the young pulled away from the elderly, parents torn from their children. Most did not know that instant, just seconds after touching the ground, determined whether they would continue living or be sent directly to their deaths. Every train that left a ghetto, a transit camp, or an occupied city was
a silent farewell.
For the Jewish communities of Europe, the deportations were the moment when collective life, built over centuries, began to disappear irreversibly.
Entire families vanished
without a trace, and the streets that had witnessed rituals, celebrations, and daily routines suddenly became empty, as
if a dark wind had erased history. Upon arrival, the deportees entered a world designed specifically for death.
There began the most brutal phase of the genocide.
A calculated system that
turned entire cities, forests, and plains of Eastern Europe into scenes of organized extermination, whose epicenter was Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Swar, Belzec, and other camps where death became a daily routine, the
extermination camps. When the Nazi regime began consolidating power in 1933, its repressive apparatus
had not yet taken the industrialized and lethal form it would later acquire. However, during those early years, it began establishing facilities that would function as laboratories of terror.
The early concentration camps, places where
methods of control, discipline, punishment, and dehumanization were perfected and later applied on a
continental scale. To understand the evolution of Nazi violence, it is necessary to examine these initial spaces: Dau, Sachsenhausen, Bannwald, Ravensbrück, and other camps, where
brutality was not yet an end in itself, but already served as a daily tool of domination. Jewish life, which at that time had not yet been formally condemned to extermination, began there to be shaped by a system whose explicit purpose was to destroy human dignity. The first permanent camp, founded only
weeks after Hitler took power, was Dha established near Munich in March 1933.
Its creation was announced in newspapers as a necessary measure to protect the German people from Marxism, criminality, and the alleged internal threat posed by socialists, communists, and political opponents.
But very soon, without formal announcements, Jews also began to be sent there. Dau became the organizational model for all later camps: a rigid hierarchical structure, commanders with absolute power, guards trained to exercise arbitrary violence,
and an internal system that humiliated prisoners without pause.
The instruction that Theodor Jäcker gave to the SS was
clear: prisoners had no rights. Their existence depended solely on the will of the guard standing before them.
Entering Dau meant undergoing a ritual of dispossession. Upon arrival, prisoners were forced to undress in front of
everyone, shaved, beaten, insulted, and then dressed in coarse uniforms that replaced their identity with a number. This process, which would later be repeated millions of times across Europe, was already a declaration of
intent. The camp was meant to break body, mind, and spirit. It was not yet about extermination, but about
accustoming men and women to a world where violence was the norm, and where the state could shape existence in
detail. In Sachsenhausen, inaugurated in 1936, a few kilometers from Berlin, the
architecture itself was designed to test surveillance efficiency.
From a central tower, guards could see every barracks
and every movement, creating a constant presence that eliminated any sense of privacy or refuge. There, techniques of extreme forced labor were tested.
Prisoners were forced to walk for hours on a test track to evaluate the quality of military boots. Others were assigned to workshops where production was combined with physical punishment. For Jews, the treatment was even more degrading. They were assigned to clean latrines, carry heavy materials, or sort garbage. Even before Nazi ideology established extermination. As a final goal, it was already clear that Jews were being singled out for a harsher fate. In Buchenwald near Weimar, terror took on more subtle but equally devastating forms. Workshops were created that supplied the regime carpentry, blacksmithing, light weapons factories. Jewish prisoners were forced to work endless shifts, weakening until they became unrecognizable. Those who collapsed were beaten or sent to barracks where diseases spread uncontrollably. Hunger was constant. Rations barely kept those who received them alive. Many survivors recalled that obsessive thoughts about food haunted them day and night, replacing any other human need. By the late 1930s, these camps began receiving thousands of Jews following specific political events. During Kristallnacht, more than 30,000 were arrested and sent to Dau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. For many, this was the first warning that the regime was willing to use its terror infrastructure directly and massively against them. Most were released weeks later, but not without a fundamental consequence. They had to sign documents committing to immigrate from Germany, renounce property, and even accept forced sales of belongings. These camps thus became not only places of punishment, but also instruments of extortion that forced Jews to leave the country under threat of death. Punishments in the early camps took forms that would later be replicated across Europe. One of the most feared was the hanging tree. Prisoners were suspended by arms tied behind their backs, causing dislocations and unbearable pain. Others were forced to remain for hours in a crouched position. And those who fell were beaten mercilessly. Violence functioned as discipline, demonstrating to each prisoner that their life had no value and that total obedience was the only way to survive. Despite the terror, Jewish communities within the camps attempted to preserve fragments of humanity. Some rabbis whispered prayers at night. Basic hygiene rules were shared to prevent disease. At times, stronger prisoners helped the weakened so they would not be selected during roll calls that could mean death. Every act of solidarity was a challenge to the system that sought to reduce them to isolated and resigned beings. The administrative structure of these early camps also revealed an unsettling intention. Precise records were kept. Deaths were counted, prisoners were classified by racial and political categories. This bureaucratic order foreshadowed a terrible evolution, a state apparatus capable of applying terror with mathematical precision. By the late 1930s, concentration camps were already an essential component of the Nazi regime. But a decisive step was still missing: transforming these centers of torture and forced labor into mechanisms of extermination. This leap, which would make Dau, Sachsenhausen, or Buchenwald mere prototypes of something far more lethal, came with Germany's territorial expansion and the formal implementation of the final solution. And this new system would have a name that would forever resonate in Jewish memory: Arbeitsbürgerkrieg. When the German occupation of Poland began in 1939, the regime had already perfected the foundations of terror in the early camps. But there was still no structure designed exclusively to kill on a continental scale. That void was soon filled. A combination of territorial control, radicalized racial ideology, and bureaucratic planning led to the creation of a network of concentration and extermination camps where forced labor and industrial murder coexisted as components of the same program. At the center of this system would be Arbeitsbürgerkrieg, a place so vast, so complex, and so deadly that it became the ultimate symbol of the Jewish genocide. Auschwitz began as a concentration camp in 1940, built on a former military barracks in the region of Oswiecim in Poland. Its initial function was to house Polish political prisoners. but its location near strategic railway lines and surrounded by rural areas easy to control made it an ideal candidate to become something much larger. When Himmler visited the area, he recognized potential that would change history in Auschwitz, massive forced labor, and at the same time, extermination facilities hidden in vast zones could coexist. It was the perfect terrain for transforming the theory of the final solution into a functioning mechanism. In 1941, expansion toward Birkenau began. Also known as Auschwitz II, a gigantic complex, with barracks for tens of thousands of prisoners, multiplied surveillance systems, separate administrative zones, and the necessary infrastructure to receive trains from all over Europe. Its internal platforms designed to allow trains to enter directly into the heart of the camp revealed the site's purpose to be a terminal station from which most deportees would never see daylight again. The typical scene in Birkenau repeated itself thousands of times within weeks. The train stopped. The doors opened with a harsh metallic blow, and prisoners were pushed out amid shouting, barking, dogs, and blows. Many could barely stand after days locked inside cattle cars without water or ventilation. SS guards issued rapid orders while women, men, the elderly, and children instinctively grouped together. In minutes, a line formed for selection, the fit for work to one side, the rest to the other. That simple gesture, a raised hand, a finger pointing left or right, determined life or death. The majority were sent directly to the gas chambers. These installations were disguised as communal baths with fake signs indicating showers and disinfection rooms. Prisoners had to leave their belongings on numbered hooks to simulate a return that would never occur. Inside, the space was sealed airtight and Cyclone B pellets were thrown in, a pesticide that released hydrogen cyanide upon contact with air. In less than 20 minutes, hundreds died, trapped in brutal silence. Then came the S-commandos, Jewish prisoners forced to remove the bodies, extract gold teeth, cut hair, and load the corpses into the crematoria. It was the most painful task in the camp, and those who carried it out lived knowing they would eventually be executed to eliminate witnesses. Their testimonies, hidden, buried, and eventually recovered after the war, are among the most heartbreaking documents about the machinery of extermination. The crematoria operated 24 hours a day. At peak activity, Birkenau could eliminate thousands of bodies per day, and when the ovens could not keep up, open-air burning pits were used. The smoke was so constant that prisoners said the sky seemed never to change. For those selected for forced labor, the torment followed another rhythm. The barracks were overcrowded with wooden bunks that held up to 8 people per level. Diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis posed a constant threat. Food consisted of watery soup filled with scraps, hard bread, and a coffee substitute that barely warmed the hands. Many prisoners lost their strength within weeks. Forced labor was carried out under constant surveillance. Auschwitz housed factories linked to IG Farben where thousands of Jews produced synthetic rubber, chemicals, or construction materials. Others were sent to quarries, ditches, workshops, depots, or roads. Each task drained body and morale, and guards beat or executed without warning anyone who moved slowly or appeared to falter. Between forced labor and selections, surviving required a combination of physical endurance, luck, and mutual assistance. Prisoners shared pieces of bread, warned each other about surprise inspections, or hid the sick to prevent them from being sent to the gas chambers. Solidarity, though difficult, became one of the few resources sustaining the will to stay alive. Despite the absolute horror, there were extraordinary acts of internal resistance. In October 1944, the Sonda commandos managed to blow up crematorium for using gunpowder smuggled by female prisoners who worked in nearby factories. It was a heroic act that demonstrated that even in the heart of extermination, a spark of rebellion persisted that the Nazis could not completely extinguish. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not the only hybrid camp of concentration and extermination. but it was the largest, deadliest, and most symbolic. Others like Maiden, Mountaussausen or Ravensbrück combined forced labor with systematic executions. But none matched the industrial scale of the complex at Oswinim.
During its most active period, Avets killed more than
10,000 people per day. Daily life in the camps. In the early concentration camps, daily
life was organized as a machinery of physical and psychological exhaustion. Although these camps had not yet adopted the systematic extermination policy that would dominate from 1940 onward, they already functioned as zones of slow destruction, where extreme discipline, exhausting labor, and arbitrary violence shaped the prisoners' everyday routines. From dawn until night, the goal was to break the will, erase identity, and prepare the ground for an even more radical form of oppression. The day began before sunrise. A whistle, a shout, or the dry sound of a baton hitting a door woke the prisoners, who had to get up immediately, even if the cold froze their breath, or the darkness was almost total. The barracks were rigid, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. Rows of wooden bunks where men or women slept packed together with rough blankets and bodies that could barely stretch. Lice, fleas, and the penetrating smell of sweat mixed with moisture covered every surface. After getting up, the prisoners ran literally to the Appellplatz, the square where roll call was conducted. This ritual, inherited from military practices, but deformed by sadism, could last minutes or hours, depending on the weather or the mood of the officer in charge. If someone failed to appear, everyone had to remain motionless until the body was found. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, others had to hold them up. To avoid collective punishment, the discipline of roll call foreshadowed what the rest of the day would be.
A constant balance between obedience, fear, and survival.
After roll call came breakfast, which did not deserve the name, a cup of hot liquid barely worthy of being called coffee, accompanied by a
piece of hard bread that every prisoner had to ration if they wanted to avoid fainting halfway through the day. Eating too fast meant hunger hours later.
Eating too slowly could mean losing the ration due to a sudden blow from a
guard.
The rules were invisible but clear. Any mistake was punished. Forced
labor began immediately.
Each camp had its own system, but the goal was identical: to exploit weakened bodies as
much as possible.
In Dhaka, many prisoners were sent to workshops, improvised factories, or construction
areas.
In Sachsenhausen, the test track where prisoners walked for hours without rest became a symbol of endless
exhaustion. In Kenwald, the quarries and SS workshops were spaces where productivity was secondary to physical punishment.
Work was organized into strict groups supervised by armed guards
or privileged prisoners assigned to maintain order.
The tasks were exhausting: carrying stones, digging
ditches, transporting beams, cleaning sewers, building barracks, moving heavy machinery.
The purpose was not to produce, but to slowly destroy every muscle and every illusion of resistance.
Prisoners knew they had to maintain a constant pace to avoid unexpected blows. Every movement was watched. Violence was not an accident.
It was the central mechanism: blows with batons, kicks, beatings in front of everyone. Punishment exercises such as repeated jumping, crawling over gravel, or remaining in painful positions for
hours. Collective punishments were frequent. An individual error could cause an entire barrack to spend the
night standing, or rations to be reduced for days. Progressive torture began this way, not as an isolated act, but as a system that infiltrated every aspect of life.
At noon, the watery soup, which did not provide enough calories for an adult, was the only break. Many prisoners ate quickly, fearing the food would run out before their turn.
Others tried to save some for later, although this reserve almost never relieved the
perpetual hunger. Malnutrition left everyone vulnerable: legs that no longer responded, fingers turning blue, wounds that would not heal, infections spreading without treatment. Work continued until sunset. On cold days, the wind cut into the skin. On hot days, the sun caused prisoners to faint. Guards used any excuse to unleash blows. A dropped tool, a wrong look, a slow step. Brutality was predictable in its unpredictability. At nightfall, a second roll call ended the day. This ritual, carried out with exhausted bodies and troubled minds, could last hours if the numbers did not match or if a prisoner failed to return. Silence was absolute. The light of the spotlights illuminated emaciated faces trying to remain upright despite trembling. Back in the barracks, prisoners could finally lie down. Some spoke quietly about their families. Others cried silently. Most simply closed their eyes to avoid thinking. Sleep was fragmented and terrifying. Any noise could mean another nighttime inspection, another punishment, another unexpected roll call. By the late 1930s, these early camps had perfected a system of total degradation. Mass killing had not yet begun, but life was consumed day by day. Work, hunger, disease, fear, and violence formed a mechanism that transformed prisoners into exhausted bodies, ready for the next phase of the Nazi project. A system in which death would no longer be a consequence but the main objective. And that shift, shaped by the absolute radicalization beginning in 1940, would manifest itself in the extermination camps, where the daily routine would no longer be a cycle of exhaustion but a perfect choreography of death. From 1940 onward, when the Nazi project adopted extermination as explicit policy, the camps ceased to be places of punishment and became components of a machinery designed to eliminate entire lives in a matter of hours. Unlike the early concentration camps, where death came slowly through exhaustion or disease, the extermination camps functioned as final stations, places where a prisoner's day could last less than a sunrise. Their time collapsed into minutes between the train's arrival, the family separation, the final deception in death, and the gas chambers. Daily dynamics in these camps had such cold precision that they seemed industrial. Everything began on the tracks. Trains arrived loaded with hundreds or thousands of deportees who had spent days locked inside cattle wagons without water or food. When the doors opened, guards shouted orders, dogs barked. Prisoners stumbled trying to get out, and the platform became chaos filled with weakened bodies trying to orient themselves. The selection was the first act of the day. An SS doctor, with a simple gesture of the hand, sent some to the site of temporary forced labor, and others to the path that led directly to death. This process lasted less than 10 seconds per person. No one asked for names, stories, or origins. It did not matter whether someone was a doctor, musician, rabbi, or child. The decision depended on immediate physical assessment. The elderly, women with babies, and the sick were almost always sent to the left toward the gas chambers. For those selected to die, the day ended just as it began. They were taken to a building that appeared to be a bathhouse. Signs spoke of showers, disinfection, and clean clothing. Everything was calculated to avoid panic and maintain order. Prisoners left their belongings on numbered hooks, convinced they would retrieve them. They entered in large groups and were ordered to breathe deeply. The door closed. Minutes later, silence replaced the screams. The following process was just as meticulous. The S-commandos, Jewish prisoners forced to work in the stages after death, removed the bodies, cut hair, extracted gold teeth, and moved the corpses to the crematoriums or to open purse when the number of victims exceeded the oven's capacity. This work, done under threat of death, devastated those who performed it. Every day they saw hundreds of new bodies. Every day they knew the next group of S-commandos would replace the previous one when it became unnecessary. For those selected to live a few more weeks, the day took on a different rhythm, though just as brutal. After the selection, they were taken into overcrowded barracks. Some worked immediately unloading trains, sorting belongings, cleaning remains, digging pits, or transporting materials. Others were sent to satellite labor camps. Work began early in the morning. There was no rest. Food, and even thinner soup than in forced labor camps, and a hard piece of bread was not enough to sustain a body under such strain. Malnutrition turned people into shadows. Their faces sank, ribs protruded, legs became unstable. Violence was constant. Guards beat prisoners for any reason. Internal selections carried out periodically inside the camp to remove those no longer useful spread terror. A prisoner could survive 3 days or 3 weeks. No one knew. Survival depended on less deadly work assignments, small acts of solidarity, leftover food, or simply luck.
Nights were torment. The barracks, filled with the sick with groans and muffled cries. The smell of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and humidity filled the air. Sleep was nearly impossible. Many feared closing their eyes and not waking up. Others feared waking in the middle of a new selection or an arbitrary execution. Darkness brought no relief. It brought uncertainty. In these camps, absolute degeneration was not a side effect.
It was a goal. The Nazis designed every
space to destroy bodies, minds, and human bonds. Death was so common that it no longer surprised.
Everything was planned.
So, time passed like a repetitive cycle of work, hunger, beatings, fear, and death.
From 1940
onward, this structure operated without pause.
Trains arrived every day. Gas chambers operated every day. Crematoriums burned every day. The machinery stopped only when there was no
fuel, when wind prevented the lighting of the purse, or when a temporary uprising, such as an attack or a
desperate escape attempt, caused a brief interruption. The tragedy was so vast
that many survivors stated that time inside the camp could not be measured in days or weeks, but in states of
exhaustion and moments between selections. Life was reduced to a single, consuming question: would there be another sunrise? Out of this uncertainty emerged Jewish resistance.
In the ghettos, in forests, in extermination camps, and even in the convoys moving toward death, Jewish resistance took shape as a complex, multifaceted, and profoundly human response. It was not limited to armed revolt, though such acts occurred and were both extraordinary and heroic, but also encompassed cultural, spiritual, documentary, and clandestine forms of defiance. In a reality engineered for annihilation, every affirmation of life, every preserved word, every child hidden away, and every improvised weapon represented a direct challenge to the Nazi project. Jewish resistance was not born from illusions of military victory, but from the belief that even when all seemed lost, dignity must not be relinquished without struggle.
Among the many expressions of resistance, the most emblematic was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943.
There, following months of mass deportations to Treblinka, groups of young, poorly armed fighters resolved that the next transport would be met with force. The Jewish Combat Organization, known as OB, together with the Jewish Military Union, ZW, assembled makeshift weapons, a handful of pistols, homemade bombs, and incendiary bottles crafted in hidden basements. They understood they could not defeat the German army, but they also knew that submitting to liquidation without resistance would mean accepting death without leaving testimony behind. When German troops entered the ghetto on April 19, expecting another routine deportation, they instead encountered gunfire from rooftops, ambushes in narrow alleyways, and snipers concealed behind shattered windows. The opening hours stunned the Germans and forced them to withdraw, prolonging the fighting for nearly a month. Despite the overwhelming imbalance of power, Jewish fighters held out among ruins and underground tunnels. Block by block, SS units set entire areas ablaze to flush them out. Mordecai Anielewicz, leader of the OB, wrote in his final letter that they had fulfilled the dream of Jewish youth by proving that resistance was possible. By the time the ghetto lay in ashes, their struggle had already become a lasting symbol of resistance in the face of extermination. Another remarkable revolt erupted in Sobibor, a camp built exclusively for killing. There, in October 1943, prisoners led by Alexander Petchersky, a Jewish Soviet officer, organized a daring uprising. Through deception and ambushes, they killed several SS officers, disarmed guards, severed communication lines, and created chaos that enabled approximately 300 prisoners to flee into the surrounding forests.
Most were eventually recaptured, but dozens survived the war.
The success of the revolt prompted the Nazis to shut down Sobibor and dismantle it entirely, attempting to erase all evidence of what had occurred, as they also did in Treblinka.
In August 1943, another group of Sonderkommando prisoners launched a revolt at Treblinka itself.
They stole weapons, set buildings on fire, and attacked guards, allowing about 200 prisoners to escape, roughly 70 of whom survived the war. These uprisings demonstrated that even in places designed to murder people within hours, clandestine organization could confront brutality.
Resistance also assumed quieter yet deeply meaningful forms.
In the Vilna ghetto, underground cultural circles organized readings, theatrical performances, and philosophical discussions to preserve identity amid total dispossession. The FPO, the United Partisan Organization, operated in secrecy, building communication networks, establishing hiding places, seeking weapons, and planning guerrilla units that might escape to the forests. Their slogan, "Let us not be led like sheep to the slaughter," echoed as a declaration of dignity across Eastern Europe.
Another vital form of resistance was documentation. In Warsaw, the Owning Shabbat archive, led by Emanuel Ringelblum, meticulously recorded daily life in the ghetto.
Diaries, photographs, reports, recipes, farewell letters, and children's drawings were buried in metal boxes and milk cans with the hope that someone, someday, would uncover them. After the war, portions of the archive were recovered, becoming one of the most powerful testimonies to Jewish life under Nazi rule. In the forests of Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, Jewish partisan groups emerged, many composed of escapees from ghettos or transports. Some operated independently, while others joined Soviet partisan units. The Bielski family, for instance, established a hidden camp in the Naliboki forest, rescuing more than 1,200 Jews and creating a self-sustaining community with workshops, makeshift schools, and defensive systems. They fought, sabotaged rail lines, and endured constant attacks. Resistance was also expressed through countless small acts of courage within the camps themselves: prisoners hiding children during selections, women smuggling gunpowder from German factories, doctors using their positions to save lives, and workers sabotaging machinery or deliberately producing faulty tools. At Auschwitz, a group of women, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Estuja Wajblum, and Regina Saferstaged, successfully smuggled gunpowder from a munitions factory and passed it to the Sonderkommando, enabling the October 1944 uprising in which one crematorium was destroyed before the women were executed. There was also spiritual resistance. Prayers whispered in secrecy, clandestine observances of religious holidays, children instructed in tradition, and rabbis who continued to teach in hushed voices all served as reminders that Judaism would not be entirely erased. Each of these acts, from armed revolt to sharing a final piece of bread, expressed the same truth: when the world collapsed, many Jews refused to accept death as the only possible response. They resisted because it affirmed that even in hell, their humanity endured. As the war progressed and the Nazi killing machine began to fracture, another decisive chapter unfolded. From the east came armies that few had expected, liberating the first camps and revealing to the world what lay behind electrified fences: the liberation of the camps. The dawn of July 27, 1944, arrived with a rumor that swept through Majdanek like a strange wind. Prisoners heard distant explosions, confused orders, and the hurried engines of vehicles that did not belong to the guards. Moments later, Soviet soldiers crossed the fences without firing a shot. There was no resistance left. The camp, partially evacuated and hastily dismantled by the SS, lay silent. The liberation of the first major extermination camp was not a triumphant battle but a revelation. The Soviets had not known what awaited them, and the prisoners could scarcely imagine seeing the outside world again. What they found was bewildering: empty barracks, mountains of shoes, piles of burned bones, and warehouses filled with stolen belongings. The stench of death permeated every corner. Some prisoners, too weak to rise, stared at the liberators with suspicion, having seen too many uniforms and heard too many promises. Others, realizing these soldiers were not Germans, wept silently, as though their voices had been erased. Those who could still walk dragged themselves forward and embraced the soldiers, scarcely understanding what was happening. Majdanek was only the beginning. As the Red Army advanced from the east and the Allies from the west, camps fell one after another. Liberation, however, did not immediately end suffering. In many areas, the Nazis attempted to erase evidence by destroying crematoria, burning documents, and forcing prisoners on brutal death marches deeper into Germany. Thousands perished along the way, shot, frozen, or exhausted. Still, some camps were discovered largely intact. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, liberated on January 27, 1945, Soviet troops entered a place seemingly frozen in time. Buildings still stood, electrified fences crackled, gas chambers were damaged but recognizable, and warehouses overflowed with suitcases, toys, eyeglasses, and sacks of human hair. About 7,000 prisoners, too sick or weak to be evacuated, wandered like shadows through the snow.
Many did not grasp that they were free.
Approaching soldiers and uttering the word Jude, meaning I am Jewish, was filled with terror, for such an admission had long been synonymous with death.
The psychological impact on the liberators was immense.
No Soviet, American, or British soldier had ever witnessed anything comparable. It was not only the sheer number of bodies, but the entire structure, the deliberate architecture of killing, the mechanized efficiency of mass murder, and the vast scale of the crime. Soldiers offered food to survivors, yet many perished after eating, their starved bodies unable to process nourishment. Doctors improvised medical care, but the extent of physical devastation was often beyond remedy. At Buchenwald, liberated by American forces in April 1945, survivors stood before journalists' cameras, revealing skeletal frames that became some of the earliest photographic evidence of the Holocaust. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops entered on April 15 into a landscape of stacked corpses, typhus-infested barracks, and prisoners barely capable of lifting their heads. There they learned that Anne Frank had died only weeks earlier, alongside thousands who could no longer speak, recognize faces, or recall their own names.
The horror was so overwhelming that many soldiers vomited or broke down in tears.
Medical relief efforts were chaotic and urgent, field hospitals were hastily established, food was distributed in carefully measured portions, and treatment began for typhus and other rampant diseases. Even so, for countless victims liberation came too late. In Bergen-Belsen alone, more than 13,000 people died after being freed, unable to recover from the effects of prolonged starvation and disease.
Emotional trauma weighed heavily on the survivors as well. Some searched frantically for relatives who would never return. Others drifted aimlessly, incapable of comprehending freedom.
Some clung desperately to Allied uniforms as symbols of survival, while others collapsed upon realizing that their homes, families, and entire lives had been erased. For many, liberation brought not relief but an overwhelming sense of isolation.
The response of the liberators soon evolved from shock to documentation.
They understood that without irrefutable proof, the world might refuse to believe what had taken place. Photographs, film footage, and detailed reports were gathered, circulated through newspapers and newsreels, and sent shockwaves through global consciousness. For the first time, genocide was revealed not as rumor or exaggeration, but as undeniable reality.
In the aftermath, survivors were moved to displaced persons camps, waiting for news of relatives or seeking a way to reconstruct their lives. Some returned to hometowns only to find their homes occupied or destroyed.
Others emigrated to Palestine, the United States, or Latin America, carrying wounds, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. Liberation did not erase the past, but it opened the possibility of renewal. Even in 1945, much of the world struggled to comprehend the enormity of what had occurred. Only through trials, testimonies, recovered documents, and survivor voices would the full scope of the crime gradually come into focus. Yet in those first days, as gates were opened and emaciated faces attempted hesitant smiles, one truth was unmistakable: the machinery of death had been dismantled, and the long process of understanding, remembrance, and rebuilding had begun.